Hello everybody and welcome back to the free online woodworking school where we aim to take your woodworking skills to the next level. In today's video, we're going to begin marking and cutting the lap dovetails for the drawer. Let's get going. Alright, so lapped dovetails. Now this is something we've done before. This is exactly the same joint that we use to attach the stretchers to the sides of the cabinets. However, in this case, it's going to be over a much wider span and we're going to be fitting two of them in there. And we've also got a groove to contend with this time. So it's going to be a fun one. Okay, so on the drawings, the size of the lap is listed as 3mm, which means that when we've got tails and stuff cut into here, there'll be a 3mm bit of material here that's preventing the end grain of the walnut from showing through. Now, if you're feeling confident, stick with that 3mm. However, if you're not too confident with your dovetails, or you want to give yourself a little bit more security when doing this, maybe just increase that to 4mm. It won't make much of a difference visually, but you have given that back wall a little bit more support, which is always nice. But we're going for a 3mm lap here. We've got a 15mm component to work with. So we need to set the gauge to 12mm, which is 15 minus 3, because we're going to be marking this from the inside of the drawer where that groove is. And so we'll just lightly score that along the end grain. I plan on removing these later, so I don't want to do it too heavily. And then same again on the opposite side. Remember, we're doing this from the inside of the drawer, which should be your non-face side in this case. And then what we'll do is just lay out the drawer on the bench. All of our face sides and edges oriented the correct way. And let's get the back in there as well. And we're going to number these corners. So 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4. And then with that information, we now know that we need to scratch the marking gauge around the front of the drawer sides, corresponding with the number that joins up with the front of the drawer. And this is going to be scratched around all four sides. Again, relatively deep. If you plan on removing them later though, don't do it too much. All right, and next we need to work out how far in we want these drawer sides to be placed. Now you've got two options here you can go with. You could either try and make these perfectly flush, which is one great option, or you can have it so the tails actually sit proud of the pins. And so in this instance, the walnut drawer sides will sit proud of the ash end grain. And that's kind of counterintuitive because quite often when you make boxes with dovetailed sides, it's often preferable to leave the pins sitting proud and then you plane them off afterwards. However, in this case, we're saying the opposite. Why is that, you may ask? The reason is, if you leave the end grain sitting proud on the drawer fronts, by the time you plane it flush, you've now made that drawer front too small to fit the cavity and it's going to wobble side to side. And so of the three options you've got, whether you choose to make the pins sitting proud, making it level, or having the tail sitting proud, do not have the pin sitting proud because you will end up making this drawer too wobbly. So then the second option is making it flush, which you've got a good chance of getting right because we've made this a pretty snug fit in the cabinet at the moment. And so by the time you plane it flush, it should release that fit just enough to become a good fit. But again, what happens if you accidentally undercut this and it ends up sinking in too far? You know, walnut's quite a soft material. What happens if that compresses too much into the ash and ends up with the end grain sitting proud regardless, and then I'll have to plane down end grain, thus making the drawer loose. So you have got to kind of plan ahead a little bit for this. And so when I'm making drawers, I have it so the tails are sitting proud. I don't do it flush. I don't do it with the pin sitting proud, the tail sitting proud. But that amount is so minuscule, like probably about 0.5 millimeter. That way I can account for any potential compression or squishiness of the walnut. I can account for any small undercut I might have put in here. And by the time it's assembled and glued in place, I can be pretty certain it's either going to end up flush or it's going to end up 0.5 millimeter above. I plane off that 0.5 millimeter and then I've got a nice flush joint to work with. And then from that point, I just work on planing it down to fit the drawer cavity perfectly. So of the three options, I would advise having the tail sitting proud. This is how you do it. All you do is clamp the drawer side upright in the vise, get your marking gauge from either side, doesn't really matter, and just bring it out until it's about 0.5 millimeter shy of the opposite edge. And so hopefully you can see what we're going for there, just ever so slightly shy of that back edge. And this setting is then scratched around the back of the drawer front. No point doing it down the front because it's a lap dovetail. You're not going to be cutting to that line and you don't want to scratch up the front of the drawer. Just the back of it, coming in from either side like that. And you can make this one pretty heavy because this won't be seen after it's assembled. And it's nice having a substantial line to cut to here. So we'll do this on both ends of the back of the drawer front. And then we take the drawer back and we're going to do that on both ends on all 4 sides because it's through dovetails on the back here. And of course, when we plane this down to that slightly narrow thickness, we are going to lose one of these lines on either side, but it's easy enough to rescribe later with a square and a knife. Okay, and then the only ones we've got to do from here are the backs of the drawer sides and how far in they're going to nest into that back component. And in this instance, this is where I might give myself a little bit of end grain to play with because the position in which these nest into the back doesn't really matter too much. And so I'll just reset that marking gauge to be a little bit beyond the thickness of the back. So something like that, just a little bit beyond. And so then we'll get our 2 drawer sides and scratch that round all 4 sides of the backs. And so with that all laid out, let's just double check everything before we move to the next stage. So we've got the laps on the ends of the front. We've got the laps going around all 4 sides of the front of the sides. We've got it going around all 4 sides of the backs of the sides, and we've got it scratched in both ends of the back. Happy days. And so now we're going to move on to marking out the dovetails, and this is where that groove can be a little bit troublesome if you get too close to the bottom, which is what I may experience here. Because you need to ensure that that entire groove is contained within the dovetail that you scratch in here, and that's contained within the top of the dovetail and also the bottom. And so the way I did that is I set a marking gauge to where the groove starts and then just gave myself a tiny mark on the shoulder line of the dovetail here. At that point, I could see where the groove was going to be down here, and I started the dovetail from that point. And so you can see if this groove was just 1 millimeter that way, that would give me an extra millimeter of space to move that across potentially, give myself a little bit more room here. But because I've done a 5 millimeter spacing, I've also had to opt for a 1 in 8 dovetail here, which will still look cool, but those of you who watch this channel often will know that I tend to go for 1 in 6. But, you know, we'll see what a 1 in 8 looks like. Because if I was to do a 1 in 6 here, the bottom of the dovetail has to start here. It can't go anything beyond that. And so a 1 in 6 would bring the top of the dovetail right out here. And that would probably only give me about, what's that, 2 or 3 millimeters either side of the tails, which would be very difficult when it comes to fitting it into the sockets. And so hopefully you can see now why it's preferable to leave yourself that 6 millimeter gap below the groove. It just makes this layout process a lot easier. The only trade-off of making it 6 millimeters as opposed to 5 is that you get 1 millimeter less space in the drawer. Shame. So we should be pretty comfortable with marking out dovetails by now. Because I've used a marking gauge to dictate the spacing from the edge on the bottom of this dovetail, I'm just going to do that on both sides. And then I'll mark out the midpoint and then space those dovetails according to the drawing. But I'm going to try and tie it in with the spacing I've got on the edges here. Okay, so that's the front halves of the drawer marked out. Now let's do the backs. And so if you're following the plans for this project, which are available on my website, the backs look very daunting. There's a lot of measurements going on there. There's a lot of different dovetails and then straight lines and stuff. Don't be put off by this. It's actually quite simple if you break it down. Essentially what it is some sort of bridle joint kind of thing, but with 2 dovetails in the middle of it. Very simple. If you think of it like that, it simplifies everything. And in fact, that thought process is pretty much how we'll be marking it out anyway. And so we've got the back of the side components here. You can see the groove there. And we're going to scratch in those square lines to start with, either side of the dovetails. And so from the top of the drawer, the first square line is coming down 6 millimeters. So let's do a little mark at 6 millimeters and then square that across. There's our 6 millimeter mark. And then coming up from the bottom of the drawer, the second square mark is level with the top of the groove. So this is going to depend on how much space you've put at the bottom of the groove and how wide the groove is itself. So in fact, it's not actually something you need to measure. In this case, on the drawings, it says 12 millimeters, but I'm just going to square it across from the top of the groove. So then we've got 6 millimeters here, and then that's whatever it happens to be, but lining up with the top of the groove. Now all we need to do is mark out the dovetails between these 2 lines. And so if you look at the drawings, all it is another 6 millimeters in from the edge of that square line, 6 millimeters in from this square line, and then we find the halfway point of them. And so that's currently 57 millimeters wide, which makes it Oh, blimey. 28.5. So 28.5 is the center line between these two square marks. And so then with that center line, we're just going to mark 3 millimeters either side of that. And then we'll just square that line, that line, that line, and that line across, and that will be the top of our dovetail. It'll all make sense in a minute. And so then we'll scribe these down the front now. So remember, the two outermost lines are straight down square, and then these 4 lines in between them are the dovetails themselves. So let's do these square ones. And then we'll mark the waist. So it's that area, and that area. And of course, we'll do that on top as well. And so then, because I'm lazy, or should I say efficient, I will clamp these together in the vise and then transfer those lines from one component to the other one. You could of course mark them together as well if you wanted. Just make sure that you've got the grooves facing each other when you do this. Okay, so that's the tails marked out on the front and the back now, and so now it's time to begin cutting them out. So again, we're not going to dwell on this too much because I've done countless demonstrations on cutting out dovetails now. Don't be put off by the fact these are lap dovetails. It is, at this point, it's exactly the same as a through dovetail. Cut down to the line, ensure that end grain is perfectly square, chisel back to the line, do the same on the back. The only difference is the square lines that we've scratched down the back. Cut those exactly as you would a dovetail, just without angling it, obviously. So that is how you lay out and cut the dovetails for the sides of the drawer. Remember, if you need a refresher on any of this, if you're watching this on the free online woodworking school, there'll be a link to that in the description if you're watching this on YouTube, by the way. In the description below the video on the free online woodworking school, there'll be a bunch of supporting resources to help you with that cutting out stage. As I said, I didn't reference it in this video in order to keep the video nice and succinct, but there is a ton of videos that I've done showing you how to do this process previously. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do not forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and you can move on to the next lesson by clicking the link below. I'll see you there.